August 28th, 2009. When the holidays approach and I think more often of home, I often think back to that day, back to that quick walk to my Brooklyn subway stop. The sun's barely lit and I'm airport bound. I descend the stairs, swipe the plastic, turn the style. Train to tram to plane. 2 hours and a lapse of consciousness later, I've landed. From plane to tram to car this time. A 45-minute drive and I'm home. In a town that once was home that I still call home on occasion, accidentally. The first stop is another home, the Oakwood home. This is not a place where people come from, strictly a place to which people go, a place to take on the sleeping patterns of house cats. Though it's called a home and people have their rooms, none of it belongs to them. A home full of people who have nothing left to lose but continue losing things nonetheless. A home for imminent death, assigned 2 per tiny room. With nothing to do but sit or lay and stare, mostly at the ceiling or the televisions, which tend to blare for 15 hours each day, their ambient drone broken only by the slam of metal doors and the nonsensicals shouted by the psychotic legless woman down the hall. "There's a ghost upstairs!" the legless woman shouts. "I love you!" Most of the first day spent waiting and watching over my grandmother, who could no longer speak or move. Waiting and watching as she's wavering between long periods of morphine slumber and silent bouts of anguish. When the opiate wanes, she opens her eyes, barely to find herself surrounded by faces unfamiliar. Then her eyes close again, and there's a muted shriek, an agony, silent but expressive. Her face wrenches horrifically like a gothic torture frieze. "I love you! I love them!" the legless lady again. "Oh, I love living alone!" Which I'm sure her roommate finds ironic. "We need to form a posse!" Now, I wouldn't say that this is unexpected, but hearing it through my big city ears reminds me how different this town is from the city which stole me away. And my grandfather's holding my grandmother's hand, doting on her, as he always has, in sickness and in health. Aware that he'll never get to dote on her in health again, he's doubled up his doting now. Hours and hours each and every day doting at her side. He knows what's coming next, but smiles as if now is all that matters. I watch his hand caress hers, knuckles swollen and skewed by age, their flesh dappled with matching sunspots. When you were sick, she could take your temperature within 1/10 of a degree using nothing but the flat of her hand. When you were a baby, she spent hours holding you lovingly with those hands. And when it was Christmas, she baked the most delicious chocolate chip cookies. A recipe you now regret never having learned by her hands. A fluorescent tube starts to flicker in the ceiling, and I'm fixated more than I should be. Then the legless woman begins to count and doesn't stop. I watch the flicker as I listen to her screaming out numbers, and it sparks madness in my mind. It drives me toward the edge, and I really want a cigarette. I want to sit and suck on sadistic smoke. Back at the airport after I landed, I bummed one from a stranger and double puffed it. I did this outside the departures level before meeting my grandfather at arrivals because a decade into my tenure as an adult, I still possessed the child's aversion to familial disappointment. And that cigarette left me wanting more, as cigarettes are wont to do. But there are no cigarettes here. No marijuana, no bourbon, no Ativan. At least not mine. To take the edge off, I'd have to steal the RN's keys and raid the prescription cart, which, admittedly, I'm considering. Outside the home, we sit in the enclosed patio area. No cement and no rough edges out here, everything rounded and rubberized as if designed for children. I'm telling my grandfather how strong he is. "She's lucky to have you," I tell him, as if that's consolation. "I'm lucky to have her," he says, so quick as to prove instinctual. And with that, I turn my face away because if he's not crying, then I sure as hell don't feel that I've got the right to. I spent years battling depression, waging a war against an enemy that doesn't even exist, and suddenly my troubles seem so trivial next to his. Suddenly, for the briefest moment, I understand it all. Life, love, the universe, the divine, what have you. And just as quickly, the coherence of that thought is gone, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to get it back, but its impression is permanent. It's bright, he says, and he steps inside to get her sunglasses. And it is bright, but I can't help feeling he's giving me a moment. And whether that's to cry or contemplate or merely visit, I'm not sure. And I'm alone with my grandmother, I realize for the first time. Possibly ever. But certainly since dementia began gobbling up her brain. All my life they'd been together, a unit, inseparable and whole. When I was a kid, my grandfather would sometimes pick me up from my parents' house and take me for a burger, fries, and chocolate shake, and he and I would be alone together briefly in his giant car. Then we'd get to their house, and they'd be together again, the way I'll always remember them when I'm their age, assuming my memory is intact. At the outset, my grandmother forgot not mathematics, nor world events, nor her parents. What she first forgot was my grandfather, the way he looks today. She'd wake in the mornings to a stranger in her bed, certainly not her husband, who was much younger and better looking. This man in bed was old and wrinkled and spotted by the sun. When he found her, wandering their country road, he'd have to convince her that her husband would be waiting there back at home, have to then change his clothes and pry her with details to prove himself. My grandfather's ardor ripened with age, and it was so heartrending to think that her last memories might be mere puppy love. As if she were a guest, looking at the mantelpiece from which all but their wedding photo had been removed. Eventually, the dementia ate up her mind in its entirety, and it seems that now, as we sit in silence on the patio, that she's got absolutely nothing left. So I stroke her hair, which is thin and dry against my fingers. And I tell her that I love her. And I tell her that I hope she isn't in much pain, but I have no idea if she understands my words or if they're carried off by the breeze, unregistered. Later on, back inside, my grandfather's angry because the RNs forgot to turn the feeding tube back on, the second time this week. And there are other mistakes, like leaving the blinds open for the sun to broil in on her. My grandfather angry? I see it now for the first time in my life. He was a sterner man in his prime, a no-nonsense National Guardsman, never violent, mind you, but he's never had that in him, but strict for sure. My entire life, though, he's played Santa Claus every Christmas and practiced competitive adoration. To this day, when I say, "I love you, Grandpa," invariably his response will be, "I love you more than you love me." So I get a little angry too, but mostly sad, because his love should be no obstacles in his final days with her. There should be no burdens on his heart beyond impending loss. Down the hall, the Legless Lady is still counting, I think. There are numbers involved, though they don't seem to be in order, and every once in a while there seem to be numerals from another language thrown in, like Aramaic or Muppet. That evening, making dinner with my grandfather at his home, my attempts at wit are often thwarted by his slackening eardrums, which is fine because I'm never witty when I'm nervous. His hearing aids shriek as he adjusts their volume, and we let TV do the talking. Occasionally we comment on the news or such, but conversation's sparse. Exhaustion sets in. His justified after countless days of vigil, mine is not. And I understand now that youth has got nothing on devotion. I sleep in the same room I slept in when I was young. In those yore days, those long weekends of McDonald's and Monopoly. Hours spent at the basement table counting colorful cash and building tiny hotels. When I'd go bankrupt, he'd let me write him IOUs, though he never accepted reimbursement. Just like years later when he'd give me money for the modest garden wedding my wife and I couldn't really afford. So I lay there listening to the forest outside, an owl cooing me asleep, just as one had when I was young. Younger, I should say, because I realized that I was and am still young. And my mind wanders to that photo of my grandmother, the one taken shortly before her descent, but long after her face had softened and antiqued. The one where she's wearing her Barbara Bush pearls and her face is all aglow. It's resting against her pillow in their bed. My grandfather placed it there to keep him company, sleeping alone for the first time in 60 years. My grandfather in love? It's the loveliest thing I've seen in my life. His best advice to me, or at least the advice that I remember best, when you're in love, never go to bed angry. It's trite, of course, but no less true. And I think about this as I drowse. I think that I'd be angry if I were him as he goes to sleep, with part of his whole being unjustly cleaved away. But he did not go to bed angry, and he did not go to bed sad. He went to bed happy, and he woke up happy, and he happily went to the home where the love of his life was now living. And he smiled, and he doted, in sickness as he did in health, because he knows that home is not here nor there, but wherever the heart has ever been. My grandmother died 2 weeks later in September, but it's the holidays when I think of her most, when I should be there with them, together at their home, eating her cookies. And I miss those cookies, man. I've tried to make them with her recipe, but they're never quite the same. Thank you.
It's his first time on the VAMP stage. Josh Cole.